This move immediately claims central space and opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for aggressive attacking play and initiating common opening systems. This is the most classical response, immediately contesting the center and mirroring white's pawn advance, setting the stage for many well-established opening systems. This move develops a knight towards the center, attacks black's e5 pawn, and prepares for kingside castling, a fundamental opening principle. This move, nc6, is a fundamental and popular defense, controlling the central d4 and e5 squares while developing a knight towards the center. Typical of many open games like the Raul Lopez or Italian game. This move initiates the Raul Lopez, a classical opening that immediately puts pressure on black's knight and indirectly challenges black's central pawn control. This move, a6, is the classical Raul Lopez opening's most popular response, posing a direct question to white's bishop and forcing it to decide whether to retreat or exchange, significantly influencing the ensuing pawn structure and piece activity. This retreat preserves the bishop's influence on the long diagonal while avoiding the immediate confrontation with black's pawn, maintaining flexibility in the Raul Lopez opening. This move, nf6, is a fundamental counter to white's Raul Lopez opening, directly challenging the central pawn on e4 and developing a piece towards the kingside, preparing for castling and applying pressure. Castling kingside secures the king and connects the rooks, a fundamental prophylactic measure after developing minor pieces and preparing for potential central pawn advances. This move abandons the typical defensive structure of the Raul Lopez and enters a sharp tactical battle by accepting the pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's kingside development and potentially gain material or initiative. This move, 6, d4, immediately challenges black's advanced knight on e4, forcing a decision and aiming to gain central space and open lines for white's pieces. This move recaptures the pawn in the Raul Lopez, opening the center and leading to sharp tactical play where black must be careful about white's initiative. This move actively challenges the misplaced knight, aiming to regain central space and prepare for potential tactical complications by reinforcing the pawn on e4. This move, 7, d5, boldly challenges white's central pawn majority by striking back in the center, aiming to create a more dynamic pawn structure and potentially open lines for your pieces. This recapture on d4 challenges black's central pawn majority and aims to open lines for white's pieces while potentially creating an isolated pawn for black if they recapture with the c-pawn. This move, bd6, prepares to recapture the pawn on d4 with the bishop after it's taken by the knight, aiming to equalize material while developing a piece. This move, nxc6, breaks symmetry and exchanges a knight for a pawn, creating doubled pawns for black and potentially a stronger pawn center for white in the long run. This move aims to disrupt white's kingside pawn structure and gain initiative, though it sacrifices the bishop for only a pawn and temporary king exposure. Moving the king to h1 sidesteps the discovered check threat after the bishop's sacrifice and prepares to defend the kingside should black's attack continue. Black's queen boldly advances to h4, initiating a direct attack on the g2 pawn and threatening mate. But this aggressive maneuver overlooks the defensive resources and pawn weaknesses created on the kingside. This brilliant capture exploits black's king's exposed position after the previous queen sacrifice, winning material and forcing black to defend against immediate checkmate threats. This move captures the rook, but it allows white to regain material and develop their pieces more effectively. continuing the Raul-Lopez exchange variation where black has sacrificed material for initiative. This move forces a queen trade and aims to exploit white's exposed king and weakened pawn structure. After black's sacrifices, leading into a more favorable endgame for black. Black recaptures the queen, forcing a major simplification of the position where white has a positional advantage due to their active pieces and black's compromised pawn structure. This move decisively wins material and simplifies the position, capitalizing on black's earlier pawn sacrifice and subsequent tactical miscalculations. The black king is forced to recapture the knight, entering a simplified endgame where white has a pawn advantage and better piece activity. This move resolves the immediate tactical skirmish, recovering the piece lost earlier and entering a simplified endgame where white has a material advantage due to the pawn deficit black has incurred. This move strategically develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to challenge white's control of the center and potentially pressure the d4 pawn. b3 aims to develop the remaining minor piece and prepare to castle kingside, centralizing the bishop on an active diagonal. This move seeks to gain space on the kingside and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure by preparing to push f5-f4, aiming to disrupt white's coordination. Developing the knight to c3 reinforces control of the d5 square and prepares to connect the rooks, centralizing pieces for the middle game. This move aims to centralize the king and prepare for active pawn play on the kingside to counter white's active pieces and pawn majority. This move aggressively challenges black's pawn structure and aims to create an open g-file. But it also weakens white's kingside considerably. This move reinforces the kingside pawn structure, preparing to develop the kingside pieces and challenge white's central control in a fundamentally broken pawn structure. This move develops the king to a safer square, avoiding potential checks on the g-file and preparing to connect the rooks for better coordination. This move aggressively challenges white's king's flank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay by opening lines for black's pieces. This capture on f5 opens the g-file and challenges black's kingside pawn structure, aiming to create weaknesses for future exploitation. This move forces white's king further out into the open, creating potential for a tactical breakthrough or harassment in the endgame. This move retreats the king to a safer square, avoiding the immediate threat of the pawn on h4 and preparing to develop the queenside pieces. This move recaptures the pawn and opens the g-file for potential play. But it also creates doubled f-pawns, which can be a long-term structural weakness if not properly supported. This move develops the knight to a more active square, eyeing the central squares and preparing to support the pawn majority on the kingside. This pawn move aims to gain space on the queenside, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially create a passed pawn later in the game. After a sharp tactical sequence leading to an unusual pawn structure, the bishop repositions to prepare for potential pawn advances on the queenside and to regain central influence. This move aims to simplify the position by exchanging black's potentially active bishop for white's less active one, creating a pawn structure that will likely lead to a rook endgame. This pawn push opens the a-file for white's rook, creating active play and offering a structural advantage by doubling black's pawns on the queenside. This move activates the rook to the open g-file, creating immediate pressure against white's king and potentially supporting a future pawn advance. With g5, this move secures the d-file, preparing to centralize the rook and contest black's initiative on the kingside. This move occupies the open d-file, increasing pressure on white's d-pawn and preparing to contest central control. Exchanging the rooks on the d-file simplifies the position, clearing the way for white's knight to become more active and potentially target black's weak pawns. The black king must step to the side to escape the open d-file, centralizing itself while the white queen and rook are no longer doubled on this critical file. This move strategically repositions the knight to a central outpost, aiming to control key squares and potentially support a pawn advance or prepare for future pawn structure dynamics. This move strategically repositions the king to a safer square on the 7th rank, preparing to support the central pawn majority and potentially challenge white's control of the d-file. This knight sacrifice exploits the weakness of black's pawns on the kingside and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, creating opportunities for white's pieces. This pawn advance on the queenside aims to create counterplay and potentially a passed pawn, challenging white's kingside initiative and central control. This move captures a pawn, simplifying the material and transitioning into a likely endgame where white's king activity and connected passed pawns on the queenside will become crucial for victory. White has just captured a pawn with nxh4, establishing a passed pawn on the 7th rank, but black's pawn on a4 aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, initiating a race. This pawn capture opens the b-file, creating an open line for your rook to potentially dominate and putting pressure on black's doubled a-pawns. Capturing the pawn on a4 creates an open file for black's rook and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses. This knight maneuver prepares to redeploy to a more active central square, aiming to control key squares and support the pawn majority on the kingside. The rook on b8 now actively contests the b-file, which has been opened by white's pawn capture, and aims to support the a-pawn's advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the crucial d4-f2 diagonal and potentially support a pawn advance or create threats on the queenside. The rook moves to b4, actively contesting the open a-file and preparing to defend the advanced a-pawn, while also potentially setting up a battery on the b-file or targeting the knight on d4. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn advance on the queenside and potentially create threats against black's king or pawns on the central files. This move aims to activate the rook by bringing it to the open c-file, potentially supporting pawn advances on the queenside or creating threats against white's king or other pieces. The knight repositions to e3 to support the kingside pawn push and potentially swing over to g4, aiming to control central squares and harass black's king. This move repositions the rook to the a-file, aiming to contest it and potentially support a future pawn advance on the queenside or pressure white's queenside pawns. This move c4 aims to control the crucial d5 square, hinder black's pawn push to b4, and potentially open the c-file for rook activity if the pawn is exchanged. The rook on g6 aims to disrupt white's consolidated pawn structure by potentially exchanging itself for the knight and creating a passed pawn for black. This move aims to consolidate white's material advantage by activating the bishop on an open diagonal and preparing to support the central pawn push, potentially leading to a protected passed pawn. The move 35, Kate6 aims to centralize the king, preparing to support the pawn advance on the kingside and potentially engage in the endgame with more active piece coordination. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square on the queenside, aiming to control the important c5 square and potentially create attacking opportunities against black's kingside pawns while supporting the knight's central presence. With your king now safer in the center, prepare to reorganize your pieces to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This knight move seeks to control the central squares and prepare for a potential breakthrough with the pawn chain, while simultaneously challenging black's rook on c6. The rook moves to c6, preparing to defend the weak pawn on c4 and potentially reposition to the d-file to contest control and pressure white's pawn structure. The pawn push c5 challenges black's central control and aims to open lines for white's pieces, particularly the rook on d1, creating attacking opportunities. This move aims to reposition the rook to a more active file and coordinate with the other rook, but it allows white to strengthen their pawn center and create threats on the queenside. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weak pawn on g6 and preparing to support a potential central advance or control key squares in the endgame. This move aims to control the central dark squares and prevent white from establishing a strong outpost on d5 with the knight, while also preparing to reinforce the kingside pawn structure. The knight repositions to c3, preparing to support the pawn advance on c5 and potentially coordinate with the other knight to exploit the vulnerable kingside. The move 40, k6 aims to bring the black king closer to the center, preparing to contest the d5 square and potentially support the queenside pawns which are currently under pressure from white's coordinated pieces. This move is a strategic decision to gain material advantage by capturing the weak pawn on a4, aiming to simplify the position and convert the resulting material superiority into a win. The move 41, rg8 continues white's initiative on the queenside, aiming to activate the rook for future play. The move white played is b4. After the exchange on the queenside, white aims to solidify the pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside if black is not careful with their pawn advancement. This move brings the king into the central fight, aiming to support the b-pawn's advance and potentially create counterplay against white's isolated queenside pawns. The knight repositions to b6, aiming to control key squares and potentially create threats against black's queenside pawns and king, while also defending white's pawn on c5. The rook now repositions to the g7 square, reinforcing the pawn on g6 and preparing to contest the open g-file, potentially leading to an exchange that could simplify the position or create new attacking avenues. This knight check forces black's king to a more centralized and potentially vulnerable square, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and prepare for further pawn advances. The king's sudden centralization, while appearing active, allows white's knight to create a decisive skewer along the c-file and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares. This move activates the knight to a central outpost, preparing to support the pawn advance and potentially create threats against black's king if it remains exposed. The move 45, rg8 repositions the rook to defend the vulnerable g-pawn and prepares to challenge white's centralized knight and potentially create counterplay on the kingside. White advances the b-pawn to b5, aiming to create a passed pawn on the queenside and restrict black's rook's mobility, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential queenside pawn push. This pawn sacrifice aims to disrupt white's rook and knight coordination, opening lines for black's remaining pieces to become more active. This move decisively wins the g-pawn, creating a passed pawn on the queenside and simplifying into a favorable endgame where white's central control and material advantage will be paramount. The rook now moves to the g6 square, preparing to support the advance of the c-pawn and potentially contest the open c-file should white choose to advance it further. This knight check forces black's king to move, enabling white to regroup the knight to a more active central square and prepare for further pawn advances or attacks on black's king. This move repositions the king to safety and prepares to support the passed pawn on c5 by potentially bringing the knight back to defend it. This knight repositioning prepares to contest the active central squares and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside, aiming to restrict black's king's mobility. This move aims to activate the rook on the open a-file, creating immediate pressure against white's vulnerable b4 pawn and potentially preparing to challenge the advanced white knight. This move aims to regroup the knight, centralizing it to control key squares and prepare for potential pawn pushes or support for future advancements. This move aims to activate the king, which has been safely tucked away and can now participate in the endgame struggle by potentially supporting the pawns or hindering white's advanced knight. This pawn push creates a passed pawn on the c-file which, if advanced, will become a significant threat and a target for the opponent's king. This move is a defensive maneuver, seeking to reposition the rook to a more active square and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the queenside, while white continues to advance their passed pawn. The king's active centralization now is crucial to support the pawn advances and contest the open files, aiming to create a connected passed pawn on the kingside. This rook check is a good attempt to exploit the open file and potentially disrupt white's king safety, although white has already consolidated well after the earlier complications. The king advances to kf4 to actively support the pawn on c6 and prepare for potential kingside play. This check forces white's king to move, allowing black to potentially activate their rook by returning it to the central files after the king retreats. The king's active positioning now prepares to support the passed pawn on the c-file and contest the critical squares on the queenside. This checking move forces white's king to a more centralized, potentially vulnerable square, allowing black to maintain king activity and look for further counterplay. The strategic aim here is to transition from the king's current exposed position to a safer square on f6, preparing for potential pawn captures and better control of the board. This move aims to disrupt white's king safety by bringing the rook into an aggressive attacking position, preparing for further threats against the vulnerable white king. The king advances to g6, initiating a direct confrontation in the center and aiming to exploit the open files in the currently vulnerable black king position. This move prepares to defend the c-pawn by bringing the rook to a more central square, which is crucial for preventing white's knight from advancing and consolidating further. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the central squares and potentially support a pawn push or create threats against black's king. This move aims to improve the rook's activity by bringing it to an open file, which is crucial for creating winning chances in the endgame. This move activates the bishop, preparing to exert pressure on the central pawns and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside by supporting a pawn push. This move aims to reposition the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting pawn pushes or creating threats along the 7th rank in this endgame scenario. The king advances to f5 to support the potential passed pawn on the c-file and to prepare for active play, aiming to corner black's king. This move is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's king safety and potentially create counterplay by forcing the white king to move again. But black's position is too compromised to expect significant advantage. This move activates the king, bringing it closer to the center to support the pawns and prepare for a decisive endgame push. The king's check forces a repositioning of the rook, aiming to control the g-file and potentially create mating threats or exploit defensive weaknesses. The king retreats to a more secure square, consolidating its position as the endgame transitions to a critical phase where pawn breakthroughs will be decisive. The rook check forces white's king back to a less safe square, maintaining material equality and setting up potential counterplay on the open h-file. The king is moving to a more active central square, preparing to support the pawn advance and potentially participate in the endgame action. This checking move forces the opposing king to move again, preventing white from consolidating their material advantage and potentially allowing black to regroup their remaining forces. This move aims to consolidate white's kingside advantage by preparing to support the passed pawn on the g-file and potentially create attacking opportunities on the central files. This move aims to connect the rooks and prepare to activate them on the now open a-file, potentially creating threats against white's king or pawns. With the opponent's king still in the center and white's king actively participating, K2 aims to improve king safety and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or center, solidifying white's advantage. This rook check aims to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially gain time for black to regroup their pieces, though white's king is well protected for now. This is a critical moment where white's king must retreat to safety on d1, anticipating black's king check on a2 and preparing to consolidate after black's rook activation. The king's proactive centralization on c4 is a key step in utilizing its fighting potential in the endgame, aiming to support the advanced passed pawn and potentially create counterplay. This move creates a powerful passed pawn, a significant endgame advantage that white will aim to promote. The rook's repositioning to the a-file aims to create counterplay and exploit the open file, potentially forcing concessions or preventing white's king from reaching a safer square. The move nf5 aims to drive the black king to a more vulnerable square, facilitating white's plan to create a passed pawn with b4 and advance it towards promotion. This move brings the king closer to the center, aiming to participate in the endgame and potentially defend pawns on the queenside, which are currently under pressure. The knight repositions to d6, aiming to control key central squares and potentially coordinate with other pieces for a future attack or defense while black's king remains exposed. The rook needs to find a more active square to pressure white's king, as the current placement on h8 doesn't directly contribute to the fight against the passed pawn. This move aims to consolidate white's king position and prepare for potential action on the queenside. Although the immediate material advantage and tactical threats are no longer the primary focus,